After World War II, the new era started, and we continue to live in this era today. This time we can call Pax Americana. This is the exact opposite of the term Pax Britannica, because the Pax Americana really exists. Pax Americana is basically an American utopia realized, the democratic liberal dream realized, because United States has today a position of a superpower, maybe the only superpower. Many political powers in the world, but only one superpower. And this position is uncomparable, unprecedented, without precedence, uncomparable to anything in the past. This United States has established several institutions and lead the world through these institutions. These institutions are of course the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. These institutions were of course created to rebuild the world after World War II, because it was a very distressing situation after World War II, not only for the ruined nations and ruined countries, but also for the United States, for which the World War II was relatively a good business. Because America was very rich, the rest of the civilized world was in ruins, basically. So America had hardly partners to have trade with and to make business with. That's why they tried to rebuild the global market, and it was very wise thing to do and necessary thing to do. After World War II, the Western Europe, for instance, asked for economic help from USA, and grew more and more dependent on America, economically, politically, culturally. To some extent we can say that Pax Americana finished already in the 60s, when the economic potentials of Western Europe was already rebuilt, and then in the 70s, when the Japanese economic power also started to compete with the American one, then we can say nothing really certain about the impact that collapse of the Soviet Union had on the Pax Americana, the American hegemony in the world, because some can say that when the Soviet Union collapsed, then United States really became the only superpower. For instance, there is no talk today about the mutual annihilation between Russia and the United States in case of some nuclear war. There are only talks about how many millions of Americans the Russian could kill if America decide one day to annihilate Russia. So one nation annihilated on one side and several millions killed on the other side. So there is no balance anymore. American nuclear power is uncomparably bigger than that of Russia, and even more than the nuclear arsenals of other states, which are uh, very, very small in comparison to uh, American nuclear arsenal. Both United States and Russia has today a couple of several thousands nuclear bombs at their disposal, but the American bombs are in a better state, better condition, usually. And apart from that, we have also 200 or 300 bombs in China, and a comparable number of bombs in France, and slightly smaller in Britain, then even smaller in Pakistan, India, and North Korea, that has only a couple of them. When I say that Pax Americana is American utopia realized, I mean that already in the 20s and 30s we can observe the tendency of liberal ideology to become more political, less economical than it was before. Many politicians between the First and the Second World War tried to be more active economically and tried to make state more active economically. So in some way Roosevelt and his New Deal think tanks were the American equivalent of the socialist planners in the East, because deregulation wasn't so fashionable anymore. People were frustrated because of the problems in international trade caused by war and then by the Great Crisis of 1929. And people demanded more action from their political elites, from the governments. And the politicians throughout the world started to play more active role in nation's economy, guided by fashionable economical theories by John Maynard Keynes, for instance. This active state liberalism became a very powerful weapon in hands of the United States politicians after the World War II, when there was a communist threat from the Soviet Union. And this state liberalism persuaded the politicians like Roosevelt and Truman, following to some extent the example of Woodrow Wilson, to guide the world towards a brighter future by promoting liberal economy and fighting aggressive nationalism and communism. And United States never really ceased to play that role in the world, although there were some differences between the American presidents on that matter. For instance, Truman acted very carefully against spreading communism, because he perceived communism as an ideology that is really, or maybe could be, very attractive for a common man. That's why he was very careful in fighting communism. And Eisenhower, for instance, he treated communism not as an alternative idea to the state liberalism or conservatism, but he treated communism as an evil This is a very serious difference between the left and the right in the United States. The left, that is the liberals, because socialism never really was never really implanted in the United States. The liberals, the left, the Democratic Party, usually perceives evil as a consequence of human mistakes and does not believe in evil per se. Some magic force of evil in the world or in human hearts or something like that. The conservatives, that is the Republican Party or the Groundhog Party, consists of people that are more religiously motivated and usually believe in the eternal fight between the wrong and the right, between the evil and the good. The most striking example of that second attitude, of this Republican religious attitude, is the attitude of Ronald Reagan, who used the expression of the empire of evil, and to name the Soviet Union. It's very similar to the Bush statement about the axis of evil between the Iraq and Iran and North Korea, which was absurd and preposterous, because there was really no connection between these three states whatsoever. Iran and Iraq were competitors and enemies, and North Korea was in the other hemisphere, and its problems were also concentrated in the other hemisphere. So this mythological view is very often ridiculed by European and other non-American politicians and intellectuals, and also the American left, that is the liberals, the Democratic Party, intellectuals and politicians connected with the Democratic Party. But regardless from the ideological differences between the Democrats and Republicans in the States, the Democrats like Bill Clinton or Harry Truman, and the Republicans, the United States play since the end of the World War II the same role in the world. And just Roosevelt and Truman, just like Immanuel Kant and Castel de Saint-Pierre, wanted the leaders of the world to discuss their problems and not to fight for their interests with military means. They wanted to replace military actions and cruel wars with diplomacy and force with persuasion. It was a dream of Kant and Castel de Saint-Pierre realized. Their dreams came true. World War II was the second human experience after the great crisis of 1929 that make the liberal elites realize that some protection of a citizen and individual from the state is needed, not only to satisfy the needs of the people, of various peoples, but also to prevent the success of more radical ideologies like communism or nationalism in situation of a lack of this political care for the good for the interest of an individual. World War II frightened the politicians throughout the world so much that they wanted to make everything to avoid it, because of pacifist thought and because of human empathy that developed through the ages, and because of course the virtues of liberals, but also because that the global economy cannot exist in the war. When the two major economic powers start a war, then the global market is collapsing. And this means economic losses for every country in the world. Because a globalized economy brings the economy and its means on the another level, better level, to secure prosperity for millions than a bunch of regional markets. The American leaders in Washington wanted to control the communist appetites and intentions by encouraging the Soviet and Chinese leaders, and then later Chinese leaders, to join the international organizations created by USA. That is, the Americans, especially Roosevelt and Truman, they wanted Soviet Union to join the UN, which was gladly accepted by the Russians, and then the Americans were very pleased with that. But Americans also wanted the Russians in other two institutions. When we look at the permanent Council of Security of the UN, we can see 3 capitalistic and 2 communist states. Of course, Russia is today no more a communist country, but the same situation continues. There are 5 countries in that council. There are United States, of course, Russia, China, and 2 European countries. 2 European powers, France and Great Britain. These 5 countries have very mixed feelings about joining other countries to these lucky 5 powers. And the Indian, German and Japanese claims, we can observe today, are welcome with mixed feelings, especially by China, that fears Japan's position, and have a very similar fears towards India. Also, Russia seemed threatened by these claims. We can wonder why the economic rule of the United States in the world took so an organized form. That there are institutions, whereas we usually combine, when we are thinking about it, the free market economy with deregulation. But we mustn't forget that in opposition to the British Empire, the United States were originally a protectionist power, which was nothing strange in the second half of the 19th century or in the first half of the 20th century. For instance, we can observe a war on tariffs between the France and Italy from 1887 to 1898, or between France and Switzerland, more or less in the same time, or between Germany and Russia in 1893, between America and the European nations. That's what I already mentioned. That high tariffs, American tariffs of 1930, the so-called Smoot-Hawley bill, signed in the United States on June the 17th, 1930, that imposed protectionist tariffs on about 20,000 kinds of merchandise. And many experts today think that these protectionist tariffs prolonged the world crisis of the 1929. When other countries responded with similar actions, the tariffs, the exports and imports, global exports and imports, became reduced to half of its previous worth. But about the institution that the United States invented to secure world peace after the World War II, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, is an international organization which is connected to the UN, and it's responsible for stabilizing the economic situation in the world. It provides financial help to countries which are deeply in debt, and of course only those that are members of the UN. This IMF was brought into existence on July 1944 at the conference in Bretton Woods, and started to operate in March 1947. Currently, 187 states are members of the IMF. The second organization is, of course, the World Bank. That's also an effect of resolutions connected with the conference at Bretton Woods. And of course it was the institution that was designed to give credit to countries that wanted to rebuild their economy after the World War II. And of course the countries controlled by the communist regime of the Soviet Russia weren't able to accept the help proposed to them. The only exception was Yugoslavia, that despite the protests of the Soviet leaders accepted this help. And for instance, the other communist countries, the other countries that had a communist government after the World War II weren't so lucky. For instance, Poland, some politicians in Poland wanted to accept this help, but the Russians took care that they couldn't. Took care of this situation so that they couldn't. So eventually only the Western European countries profited from this help, and some of these countries used this money better and some worse than others. For instance, Great Britain had a prolonged time of economic difficulty after the World War II because British politicians decided to pay the national debt with that money given to them by the World Bank. Of course, this financial help from the United States after World War II to the Western European countries, and proposed also to the East, but not accepted by Stalin. The Marshall Plan was one of the first impulses to unite Europe after World War II also. So one can say that Europe was uniting after World War II, primo because they were frightened by the and endangered by the Soviet power at the east, on the east, and secondly, they wanted to combine their economic potential to rebuild the economy sooner. As I said, some countries use this money, American money, better, and some worse, in a worse way. For instance, Germany used this money mainly for investments in industry and so on, and rebuilding the full potential of pre-war German, famous German economy. The UN, the Marshall Plan are the examples of American soft power, the post-war soft power, this situation in which the American politicians and leaders combine the role of a missionary and a liberal thinkers is very characteristic, and it's very similar to the British attitude towards the world's problems in the 19th century. The main difference is that the Americans had really the chance to realize their concepts, whereas the British were not able to do so for most of the time. But the United States is mainly known for using the hard power and not the soft power, which is a little bit an unjust opinion, but it's very striking feature of the American policy after World War II. And it was this tendency of using the hard power, of playing the role of the international policeman, world policeman, by the United States, was noticed and very often criticized by other governments. For instance, the European Union in last decades developed this concept of soft power, the convergence, and so on. The way of securing power by helping underdeveloped states and peoples in their economic development. And it's a very interesting example of a collision between the concept of hard power and soft power during the Vietnam War also, when the Americans were spending huge amounts of money every day to fight the Viet Cong, and the Japanese were promoting these concepts of theirs, that is the Asian zone of prosperity. Were of course some misunderstanding, because this slogan was compared to the imperialistic claims made by Japan during the World War II and before the war. This time in the 1960s, this was a totally peaceful way of securing the prosperity in the zone, and the Japanese converted to pacifism. And they really proposed this to the Americans, that the Americans shouldn't put so much money into fighting Viet Cong, and to take the money they spent, the amount of money they spent every month to fight Viet Cong, and give this money to the Vietnamese. The concept was that if the Vietnamese would be given such a big amount of money, they wouldn't sympathize with communists anymore. They would turn into good homines economici. These collisions between the American hard power and European or Japanese soft power makes us often forget that the Americans were the real inventors of this soft power, or maybe not the only inventors, but one of the most important inventors of this soft power. The United Nations and its program referred to the Wilsonic slogans of national sovereignty and the right of every nation to have their own state, which is very funny in a way, because America itself is a multinational state. But this claims that Wilson has made during the First World War resulted, among other things, in collapsing of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, also multi-ethnic state, but not a melting pot, but rather a fabric of different dominions, neighboring different dominions. The UN accepted the rule of a peaceful, of solving all the conflicts in a peaceful way by discussion and by the work of diplomats. Also, the rights of men were promoted by the United Nations, and first and foremost by the American democratic government of Roosevelt and Truman. Also, United Nations and their American leaders and their allies advocated that all the states should act together to prevent wars, that they should secure good education and knowledge in accordance to the typical Enlightenment, typical statement of the era of the Enlightenment, that all evil, all injustice results from ignorance. So United Nations were also promoting good education, securing good education for peoples. United Nations have also advocated from the very beginning that there should be no competitions in establishing bigger armies and so on. No arms race. All regulations against the proliferation of nuclear weapons, later resolutions in later decades, were the natural consequence of this statement. The League of Nations, the predecessor of the UN, was also an American idea proposed by Wilson after the World War I, the First World War. It was the statute of this league was accepted by the Peace Conference of Versailles in 1990. And the competence and the field of interest of League of Nations is almost the same as the of the UN. Of course, so far United Nations, although very often criticized, for instance, for their prejudice against several states, for instance against Israel, and criticized for being something like a spice nest, criticizing also for criticizing everything that could be criticized. But the United Nations is so far the form of League of Nations, the better form of League of Nations that still exists and do some good work in the world. Although today the United Nations has more competitors, for instance the European Union also shows a very clear interest of doing some work that was until now mainly done by the United Nations and the Council of Security of the United Nations. It could be disputed if we are still living in the era of American hegemony, in the era of Pax Americana. For instance, the Indian-born American politologist Fareed Zakaria is of an opinion that the Pax Americana was still in force by 2005, but no, it's not no more. It's not today. In this 2005, the American Defense Secretary Colin Powell, the American Secretary of State for President Bush, was in a plane heading to Europe to solve a conflict between Spain and Morocco about a couple of islands situated between those two countries. And he really came there as like a king whose arbitrary powers cannot be questioned. He has read everything about the problem, about these islands, on a plane, and in a very short time, very short notice, he resolved the problem. Both Spain and Morocco were more than happy to accept the terms he proposed. Farid Zakaria is of an opinion that something like this couldn't happen today, because after the invasion on Iraq, American credit in the world collapsed and diminished. Many other countries started to play a similar role towards their regions. For instance, the French President Sarkozy visited Georgia to secure a peace there. The Indians and the Chinese and the Russians also tried to secure peace within their regions, within the regions where they could play a role of the leading power. Only a couple of old American allies like Britain or Japan were still supporting most of American actions to secure peace in the world. So we cannot say if we are really living in yet in the era of American hegemony, of Pax Americana, but we really can say that many of the rules in thinking about the securing the international peace were invented by American political leaders. The French economist, for instance, French economist Guy Sormand argues that maybe this missionary spirit of the usually quite religious Americans played a very huge role in this American mission of the peace in the world. But it could be something similar to the British spirit of the 19th century, universally felt and shown by liberal deists and conservative Christians of Great Britain. Today the American hegemony is challenged by China and Europe. China has joined the IMF, but it's not obeying its rules, and Europe has given a Peace Nobel Prize to Barack Obama, mostly for being a sort of an anti-Bush politician. So we can feel this spirit of opposition against the American hegemony today. Some are arguing that it's a very sinister tendency, and others are rejoicing in this change. But no one can deny that something is changing in that matter.